Please welcome one of the great leaders of all time, President William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Whew. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan, for the wonderful introduction. Dr. Carruthers, distinguished platform guests, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for giving me a chance to come here and to speak with the young scholar athletes about the present and your future. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on the accomplishments which brought you here. I kind of wish that this program had been available when I was your age. I might have been a better athlete and later avoided heart surgery for all I know, only I'd had the chance. I want to speak today rather briefly, and then we'll try to most of the time for question and answers. I find that when I'm answering questions, I'm much more likely to be talking about what the audience wants to discuss than when I'm just giving a speech. But since you come from all over the world, I want to begin by saying that every young person in every country who cares about the welfare of his or her community and nation and the future that you hope to have should be able to ask and answer four simple questions. Number one, what is the nature of the modern world? What is the fundamental characteristic of the world into which you will soon enter as an adult? Number two, how would you like to change it? Number three, if you were going to change it, what would you do? And number four, and most important, who's supposed to do it? And what are you supposed to do about it in particular? Now, thank you. When you see that picture that used to be up there back when I didn't have any gray hair, when I was almost 17 meeting President Kennedy, I liked him because he asked me not what my country could do for me, but what I could do for my country. The larger question today is, what will we all do to save the world and make it a better place, one into which you can bring children who might someday participate in these scholar-athlete games? If you ask me to say in a word, what is the nature of the modern world, I would not say globalization. That's what most people would say, but that's not what I would say. Because for most people, globalization, number one, has a purely economic meaning, and number two, it largely means relations between two nations or among nations on economic terms. I would use the word interdependence because the world is coming together today in ways that go far beyond economics. Yes, there's a lot of trade. Yes, $1 trillion U.S. crosses national borders every day in financial transactions. But there's also travel, there's the global media culture, there's information technology. We have people here from Australia. I have a cousin who lives in the mountains of North Arkansas in the middle of this country who for many years played chess with a man from Australia once a week over the internet. They took turns deciding who had to stay up all night. But that too was an example of our interdependence. Your very presence here is an example of our interdependence. These gains for people your age would probably not have been considered 15, 20 years ago. And within societies in wealthy countries, we're growing more interdependence. One of the most interesting debates we're having in America today is what to do about our immigration policy in a land where everybody but our native peoples, we're all immigrants, or our forebears were. So Rhode Island, for example, has the country's highest concentration of people of Portuguese descent. Not so many as Brazil, but still a lot. So we're a nation of immigrants, but we have to protect our borders in an age where we worry about terror. And we want to protect our laws, so we don't want to put people who come here illegally, even if they work hard, pay taxes, and send the money home to their folks. We don't want to put them ahead of law-abiding people in the race to become an American citizen. So it's a very difficult problem, but it's a problem of interdependence. Now, the thing about interdependence is it can be positive, negative, or both. For example, think about all of you here. If you wind up competing in good spirits and learning about people from halfway around the world, their cultures, their religions, their politics, and enjoying it and respecting them, that's a positive experience. If you wind up having a debate based on religion and you think it's unreconcilable, then it might be a negative experience. The same thing is true with the world. Interdependence has been good for most Americans, but for half the world it's not such a good deal because it's unequal. Half the world's people still live on less than $2 a day. 10 million children die of preventable illnesses every year. 1 in 4 of all the people who perish this year on Earth will die of AIDS, TB, malaria, and infections related to dirty water. Cholera, dysentery, diarrhea. 80% of the people in that last category will be under 5 years of age. And yet, those of us from wealthy countries, nearly no one we know will die of any of those things. And this interdependence is unstable because just as we share all the benefits of open borders, easy travel, easy immigration, so do we share the burdens. We're all vulnerable to terrorism. We're all vulnerable to these conflicts rooted in religion or racial or ethnic differences. We're vulnerable to at least small-scale weapons of mass destruction. And we're all vulnerable to now the spread of global disease. Avian influenza is such a hot topic now that in the last 2 months on primetime news in America, we have learned of chickens with avian influenza in India, Indonesia, and Romania. And we know how many chickens were killed within 3 square miles of that infected chicken. It would be funny 10 years ago, but it's not funny at all now. We perfectly understand that wherever we live in the world, we could be exposed to a global epidemic because of the way we travel around. There's now a phenomenon called airport malaria, where people who come from countries that never had a single case of malaria come down with it because they passed someone who was infected in an airport. And we are all especially vulnerable to the depletion of oil on which most civilizations run and to the rise of global warming. We share these vulnerabilities. So if you live in an interdependent world that can be good, bad, or both, and if that world is unstable because of our shared vulnerabilities and unequal, how would you like to change it? I would like to leave the world with a set of more integrated communities, locally, nationally, and globally, moving from interdependence, which is just all interdependence means is that you can't escape each other. That's all it means. Divorce is not an option. You can't get away from one another. Just a little planet, we're all moving around. I would like to move to a system where we share responsibilities and opportunities, and we have a shared sense of belonging to a common humanity. Now, lots of times when I say that we should move from interdependence to integrated communities, some people look at me in a skeptical way and say, how naive could he be to think that we could ever build a world where across all these differences, where people are dying like flies all over the world in these conflicts, where we could actually have a system of shared opportunities and responsibilities and a shared sense of an inclusive community. And I say this may be the most important thing I say to you tonight. It can happen if, but only if, we understand the true meaning of our differences. Our differences do matter. Some of us are black, some are white, some are brown, some are some other pigment. Some of us are Christians, some Muslims, some Jews, some Buddhists, some Confucians, some Jains, some whatever else. Some of us are liberal, some of us are conservative. These differences are good. They do matter. They are important. They are important for two reasons. First of all, they make life more interesting. America is a lot more interesting place than it was 30 years ago because we've grown more diverse. It's interesting. Secondly, our differences aid the search for truth. Because since none of us knows everything, it's only by listening to people with different perspectives, arguing, discussing, sharing what we know, that we ever make any progress. So our differences matter, but our common humanity matters more. That's the only thing you have to believe to bring the world together. And all these wars and all this killing and all these people dying in every country, they're all dying because the people who killed them believe that our differences are more important than our common humanity. That our differences define our humanity. And this is very important. Almost every religion teaches humility in some form or another. Teaches us that we are imperfect, that life is a journey toward the truth, but that no one is ever in full possession of the truth. Not that there is no truth, every religion believes there is, but that no imperfect human being can be in full possession of the truth and turn it into a political program that's fully true. If you believe that, then it's okay to kill people who disagree with you because they're by definition less human than you are. So I ask you to think about that. To me, if you don't remember anything else I say, remember that. Our differences do matter. You're having more fun here today than you would have if you all looked alike and thought alike. And you're going to learn more than you would learn if you all looked alike and thought alike. Now, that's what I'd like the world to be like. How could we get there? How could you move from interdependence to integrated communities of shared responsibilities, shared opportunities, and an inclusive sense of community based on our common humanity? Well, I think we have to do three things. Wherever you're from, a rich country, a poor country, something in between. First, we all need security policies. We need to not be naive here. There are people whose minds we won't be able to change in their lifetimes. And therefore, we need to work together as best we can against terror and weapons of mass destruction, against the killing of innocents in places like Darfur. We need also to recognize that fighting disease like avian influenza is a security strategy. And we must do something about global warming before it has calamitous consequences for the young people in this audience. I'm convinced that there are people in this room today who will live in a very different, much more insecure, much less happy world if we don't change the way we use energy and the way we generate economic growth in the world. Now, I'll come back to that. So we need a security strategy. But remember, the world is interdependent. We can't get away from each other. Our borders are open. I take it no one in this immigration debate really believes that you can make the entire Canadian border with the United States, the entire Mexican border with the United States, our entire border with the Atlantic Ocean, our entire border with the Pacific Ocean, our entire border with the Gulf of Mexico, that we could make it 100% secure, so no bad thing could ever happen from across the border. In an interdependent world, if you can't kill, jail, or occupy all your adversaries, you have to make a deal. You have to try to make more partners and fewer terrorists, more friends and fewer enemies. And that means that the wealthy countries should help the poor countries to alleviate extreme poverty. It means we should get rid of diseases which primarily affect poor people, like AIDS, TB, and malaria, and we know how to do it. It means that we should put the 130 million children in school who never get to go to school even a single day, and upgrade education in the poorest countries, because 1 year of schooling in a poor country adds 10% a year to the earning potential of a young boy or girl for life. Just 1 year of schooling. So we know how to do that. And for those of you who are Americans or Europeans, or if there's anyone here from Japan or Australia, any of the countries with higher incomes, I can only tell you that in our country, for America to pay its fair share of a plan to get rid of extreme poverty, people living on less than $2 a day, to turn the tide on AIDS, TB, malaria, and other infectious diseases, and to put all the poor kids in the world in school, would cost us somewhere between $25 and $40 billion a year for 10 years. Now, lest you think that's a lot of money, that's about what repealing the estate tax will cost for less than 1% of the American people. We spent, I can say that because that affects me, and I never had any money before I left the White House, so I love to say that. I wake up every day feeling lucky. I don't begrudge paying my taxes. I think, it's part of the price of civilization. So I don't understand why people like me keep thinking we need to get away with less when there's so many other greater needs. But it's about, we spent $300 billion in Iraq in about 3.5 years. So $25 to $40 billion is not all that much money in a $1.5 or $7 trillion federal budget. And it's always cheaper than going to war. You have to have a defense, you may have to fight. But making more partners and fewer terrorists and fewer enemies is always less expensive than going to war. And it works. And let me just give you an example. There are 2, and only 2, Muslim countries where opinion of the United States has dramatically improved since we went into combat in Iraq. Do you know what they are? The largest, Indonesia, and ironically, Pakistan, which has the largest number of its people on its western border sympathetic with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. How in the world could their opinion of America get better? Because of the tsunami and the earthquake. Because when the tsunami hit Indonesia, Americans gave $1.2 billion in aid. The Army dropped food and not bombs. The civilian government workers went there. Religious and non-religious, non-governmental organizations went. Even I just saw business people when I went there with former President Bush. Just business people just pulled up what they were doing and went there and asked to be sent to villages where the water had been destroyed and put their water purification equipment up so no kid would get cholera. Paid their own way, went there, didn't belong to any organization. And 1/3, or almost 30% of our households gave money for the tsunami. On a per capita basis, Northern Europe, which lost a lot of people in the tsunami, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom gave even more than we did. And what happened? All of a sudden, politics didn't matter anymore, religion didn't matter anymore, race didn't matter anymore, geography didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered. We were together in a moment of excruciating pain and human need. They saw us as people, and we saw them as people. And the same thing then happened in Pakistan when they had that terrible earthquake. Same deal happens. Now Pakistani children want models of American military helicopters because they see helicopters as dropping life-saving food and medicine. So it's important to remember that while you need a security strategy, you've got to have a strategy for more partners and fewer enemies. And the third thing you have to have is home improvement. I always hate to say that in America because we got a TV show named Home Improvement. And I keep thinking people expect me to come volunteer to repair their home. But what I mean by that is, in the wealthy countries, we have to keep getting better in meeting our challenges. Otherwise, there'll be no consensus among our citizens to help others. And in the developing countries, you have to get better at meeting your challenges. Otherwise, no matter how much money somebody gives, it won't do any good. And if I could just say a word about that, one thing I've learned in my increasingly long life is that intelligence and ability are evenly distributed in this world. But opportunity, investment, and organization are not. These games succeed because they're well organized, right? Somebody you may not even know did half the organizing work on this. And if you're a contestant, you just show up and play. But it works because it's well organized. You expect this event to be well organized. You expect the air conditioning to work so you're not hot in the muggy temperature. You expect the lights to stay on so you can see me talk. You don't expect the microphone to turn off. There are whole countries where none of these things could be taken for granted, where you could haul half the citizenry in and they would be shocked to see all of this. So we have to work on home improvement there. And the rich countries have to work on home improvement too. In America, we got an economic problem. Our deficit's too big, middle-class wages aren't going up enough, poverty's on the increase, we're not creating enough new good jobs. We have an energy problem. We have 4% of the world's population, 21% of its income, and we emit 25% of its greenhouse gases. And if we don't change, then the Chinese and the Indians won't change, and when they get as rich as we are, we'll just all burn the planet up together. We have a health care problem in America. We spend too much for too little. And that's a serious problem in this country. And we have an education challenge because we're not educating enough scientists and engineers. And so we have to do more of that. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details of that, but the point is, home improvement matters. If I were a young person starting out in life, if I were 25 and had a master's in business, I would go into clean energy, and I would become very wealthy doing good. Because we cannot continue to generate economic growth by putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere through the burning of oil and coal. We have got to start burning something else in our cars. We either have to go to electric cars, hybrid cars, or biofuels in the short run. Eventually, I think we'll be on fuel cells. It's unconscionable that we haven't raised fuel mileage standards in this country in such a long time. And other people are doing it. Even the Chinese that put more coal into the atmosphere than we do, burn more coal, have better car standards than we do. We have to build more efficient buildings and homes. We have to generate electricity more efficiently. We have to recover the CO2 from coal and put it back into the ground where it can't come up. We've got to run our manufacturing more efficiently. But the good news for America is that solves our economic problem, because we need a source of new jobs in this country every 5 to 8 years if we're going to keep our borders open, trade with others, and keep inflation down. We could create millions of jobs in this country if we just decided that we wanted to save the planet. And for those of you who care about this, there's something for everybody to do. There's an endless number of things that can be done, and in our country, it's all good for the economy. If I were working in a poor country where half the people didn't have electricity, I wouldn't try to hook them up to an electric grid burning coal. I'd electrify them quicker by putting small photovoltaic solar cells on their roofs enough to turn on the lights, run a television, let children study at night, let women work at sewing at night, do all the things that need to be done. It can be done for about $300 a household, and you'd be amazed how many people could pay that off over 3 to 5 years, even in countries where the per capita income is $2 a day or less. There are so many things we can do, but if we don't, and the world keeps warming at its present rate, here's what's going to happen. The ice cap on Greenland is already melting. That's 8% of all the fresh water in the entire world is on top of the island of Greenland. If it were all to melt, the ocean level would rise 21 feet. We'd lose about 100 feet of Manhattan Island, where my office is. Most valuable real estate in America. Big parts of Shanghai would flood. East Coast cities would flood. Half of Bangladesh would be underwater. India's cities on its east coast would flood. You'd have massive problems. The water would even go up into Beijing, and it would turn the world upside down. It would also block the Gulf Stream, which comes from the south up to the north and allows northern Europe to have bearable winters. And then it sinks and goes right back down to keep the cycle of the oceans working. If all that fresh water piles up in the North Atlantic, the Gulf Stream will be blocked. And northern Europe, perversely, because of global warming, will become even colder as the hot parts of the world get even hotter. None of this has to happen. But we have been in denial about this for long enough. And for those of you who still question it, I urge you to see my friend Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. It's a great movie. It's really good. And it'll convince you that this problem's real. But here's what I don't understand. Why do we even debate whether it's real or not if there's a good chance it's real? And I'm convinced it is, and so are all major scientific studies confirming this. And we know if we do it right, it'll be good for our economy, not bad. It'll create millions of jobs. It'll liberate us from foreign oil from unstable places in the world, so we can improve our economy, improve our national security, and make the environment better. Why would we walk away from this? My generation owes it to you before we exit the stage to leave you the same chance to raise your children and grandchildren that we had. And this is the only way to do it. Now, so that's how to move from interdependence to integrated communities. Security, partners, home improvement. Last question, who's supposed to do it? Well, the government, of course, has to do a lot of this in every area. But private citizens have more power to do public good today than ever before because of the rise of democracy, because of the rise of the internet, and because of the rise of non-governmental organizations. In a world with a global media culture, even non-democratic cultures, societies, have to be sensitive to public opinion. Remember when the SARS epidemic broke out in Hong Kong and then spread to Canada a few years ago? Everybody knew it came from mainland China. Originally, the Chinese government denied it. Then the Chinese citizens jammed their websites. All the government's websites, demanding they tell the truth, and to the credit of the government, they turned it on a dime, they admitted it, and they cooperated with us, and SARS could have killed tens of thousands of people. It was shut down with relatively few casualties. The internet's changed everything. When Americans, 30% of us gave to the tsunami, over half of us gave over the internet. Over last time in the presidential election in America, for the first time since campaigns became expensive, small contributions were bigger than big contributions in total because of the internet. So I ask you to think about that. What that means is if people like you with not very much money at all decided at the same time that you cared about the same thing, you could change the world because of technology. You could get 100, 200 million people buying something, buying into something because of that. And the third thing, and most important, is the rise of non-governmental organizations, citizens groups in communities and around the world. There are millions of them now. When I became president, there were none in Russia. Now there are 63,000. There were none in China when I became president. The first year you had the Goodwill Games, these games. There are now 265,000 registered, probably 3 times that many unregistered. The biggest one in the world just got twice as big. Bill Gates' foundation, Warren Buffett's going to give them $31 billion, and it's going to be big. It's great, and they'll do great work. But there are millions you never heard of, like the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, which gives little bitty loans to village women so they can start their own businesses and their kids can afford to go to school and not be at work. And the mothers can build up a little wealth and start a family savings account. And they're all over Africa, they're all over Latin America, they're all over East Asia. These places are everywhere. That's what I do now that I'm not president anymore. So when former President Bush and I, we raised money for the tsunami or Katrina, we created a fund that funded projects to make a difference in people's lives. We became non-governmental organizations. When Bob Dole and I raised money to guarantee college scholarships to the children and spouses of everybody killed or disabled on 9/11, that's a non-governmental organization. It'll exist for 20-something years. So we've gotten everybody out of college, including children that were in their mother's womb on that fateful day. When I go around the world trying to help provide the least expensive AIDS treatment in the world, that's an NGO, a non-governmental organization. I get a bunch of them together every year when the UN opens. Last year, I told everybody that came to my meeting they couldn't just talk, not to come to my meeting, save your money, stay home, unless you're going to make a commitment to do something or spend some money to alleviate poverty, fight climate change, improve the governance of poor countries, home improvement, or bridge religious divides around the world. In 2 days, I raised $2.5 billion from 500 people. Now, so what's that got to do with you? You don't have to have any money to make a difference. Earlier this week, there was a wonderful open letter in the local newspaper. Some of you probably saw it, from a man named John Galooly. Good Irish name. His daughter, the first year they had these games, was too young to be in them, so she volunteered. Today, his daughter is the project manager of my AIDS project in Rwanda, a place that had a terrible genocide, that is trying to come back together, where there were no health networks left in the rural areas, so even though I could get them AIDS medicine at the cheapest prices in the world, there was nobody to give the medicine out, nobody to diagnose, nobody to treat, nobody to monitor, nothing in these rural areas. So a wonderful American doctor who spends half the year at Harvard and half the year at Haiti, Paul Farmer, agreed to take his system, which trains non-doctors and non-nurses to do basic medical stuff, to serve larger and larger groups of people so that the doctors and nurses see only those they have to see, to Rwanda. And we've been working there less than a year. In one rural hospital where this young woman works, they're treating 1,000 people who weren't getting any medicine and couldn't before. And we're getting them the medicine at the lowest prices in the world. And it's 1,000 more people that are going to live because somebody just like you, decided that it was worth a year of her life to go halfway around the world to serve people who otherwise never would have seen anybody who gave a rip about keeping them alive. 1,000 lives. And there's something you can do in your own community, there's something you can do in your own country, there's something you can do halfway around the world. I hope you'll all be good citizens of your country. I hope you'll all vote. I hope a lot of you will run for office. But I know this. If there ever comes a day, wherever you live, that everyone you vote for wins, and you agree with everything they do, and the economy's in good shape, there will still be holes in the fabric of life in every country and around the world into which citizens will have to step. Your generation has a heavier responsibility to do that because you were the first to come of age in a time of global interdependence. You can't get away from each other, but you can hold hands and make sure that your children and your grandchildren and their grandchildren will also have the chance to live their dreams. So that's my message. Go out and do it. Thank you, and God bless you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President has agreed to take some questions. And a little earlier today, we polled the students here and pulled out 4 or 5 questions we think represent the kinds of questions that you're interested in, the kinds of questions that you're asking. So, Mr. President, I'm going to ask you the first of those questions. And since this is a large group of bright young people who are leaders in their own countries and going to be leaders even more in the years ahead, want to know what you think the greatest challenge is that they will face, and how will they prepare themselves to meet that challenge?
Well, I think that, first of all, each of you may have a different personal challenge. I think as a globe, in the near term, our greatest challenge is figuring out how to diffuse all these conflicts before terrorists get a hold of weapons of mass destruction and kill a whole lot of people. But in the medium to long term, our biggest challenge is dealing with climate change. Because in the end, the terrorists will not be able to destroy civilization. They may kill more people in America or other places, but no terrorist movement has ever overturned any free society standing alone, and it's not about to happen now. And there are thousands and thousands of people we don't even know who are the most important frontline warriors here. They're the police and intelligence services of all these countries that are working together, and 24 hours a day they're breaking up these cells, interrupting their money chain, preventing terrorist attacks. They can't be 100% successful, but I'm convinced we're going to win that. So in the near term, I'm most worried that before we see this wave of terrorism ebb, one of them will get a hold of a weapon of mass destruction of some kind, a small-scale nuclear bomb or chemical or biological weapon. If you want to know what you can do about that, the best thing you can do is to make sure that in every country you live in, you first of all have a good homeland security plan, a good plan to do the right things. If somebody should release chemical or biological agent, does your community know what you would do? And secondly, you should try to do what you can to prevent it from happening by making sure that there are good lines of communication and real relationships across diverse communities where you live. I mean, if you look at Rwanda, I mentioned Rwanda, they killed 10% of the country in 90 days, mostly with machetes. And people that have been neighbors forever and a day all of a sudden turn on each other in a climate of fear. Now, that climate of fear could not have been generated by unscrupulous leaders if there hadn't been something going on underneath that cooperation. One of the most traumatic things for the British in the bus bombings in London, and the underground bombings, was that the people who perpetrated them were not infiltrators from another country, as happened on 9/11. There were people who'd lived in the UK for a long time. So you can try to keep that going. Now, the medium to long term, there's no question that if we fundamentally alter the climate, you're going to have more deserts, drastic water shortages, more wars over water and natural resources. If some petroleum geologists believe we're going to run out of oil on Earth within 35 to 50 years, I would say almost half of them believe we've already reached about half of all the recoverable oil has been taken out. of the earth. So, and we need oil. It's the platform on which the rest of our energy system stands. So the only way to make it last for another 100 years until we can live on a hydrogen economy is to start using much, 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 much less of it. We've got to change transportation in the ways I mentioned, higher mileage vehicles, different fuels, more light rail, high-speed light rail. We've got to change our other usage, and we've got to reduce the amount of emissions from coal into the atmosphere, and we've got to plant more trees instead of cutting them down. There's too much deforestation in the world, especially in the rainforest. So those are the things I would say. Now, on a personal level, let me just say this. Your biggest challenge as a person, in terms of what I talked about tonight, is figuring out what you'd really like to do with your life and then putting yourselves on the line to do it. If you engage in athletics, every time you compete, you know you might lose. If you were paralyzed by that, you never compete. And if you never win a championship, you're better off for having competed. You're healthier, you're stronger, you understand teamwork, you understand discipline. Your mind works better. The effort enhances the quality of your life. Everything else is like that too. I'm 60 years old almost. I go back to all my high school reunions. The people, I've watched all of us age in different ways in different times. I've seen my classmates buried, and I've seen them bury their spouses, and sadly on a couple of occasions bury their children. But I can tell you that the saddest people are not the people who've had adversity or failed. The saddest people are those who never tried to live their dreams. So my advice is, try. And I watched it go on my entire adult life. And when I ran for president, I promised myself if I could do something about it, I would. My people came from Fermanagh, County Fermanagh in Northern Ireland, and they came from a little village that was on the border. So I worked at it, and we made a lot of progress. But the real thing that happened was the Irish people, the walking around people, the citizens, the Catholics and the Protestants finally decided that they didn't want to be represented by people that were stoking their hatreds. And they saw the Irish Republic having the fastest growing economy in Europe, and they saw themselves being left behind, and they realized that all this fighting was totally counterproductive. It was robbing their children of a future, and it didn't make any sense. So I think that while visionary leaders are important and outside help is important, grassroots citizen opinion is important too. People, the Irish always come up to me and thank me for my role in the Irish peace process. I think they did it. I mean, I think their leaders were great, and a couple of them won the Nobel Prize, and that was richly deserved. But the Irish people decided they were going to have peace, and the leaders basically followed the people. If you look at tougher cases, Bosnia, it's a tough case. But the Bosnians, we had 2.5 million refugees and 250,000 people killed there in 2 years. And it took military action and a tough peace agreement to bring an accord, but it's held. And it's a lot better than war. People who say it's not very good now don't remember what it was like when people were dying like flies there. If you look at the Middle East, the hardest place of all, arguably, you forget that when I was president, we had 8 years almost of progress toward peace. And after I left, 4 times as many people were killed in the next 4 years, both Palestinians and Israelis, than were killed in the 8 years I was president. They were no less interdependent. They had, first of all, I give a lot of credit to the Israeli and Palestinian leaders that worked out the agreement. I give enormous credit to Yitzhak Rabin, who lost his life fighting for peace in Israel. One of the greatest people I ever knew. I never loved another man more than I loved him. I was an amazing human being. But they can do it again. They're no less interdependent today than they were when we were signing all those peace deals. They just decided to go from positive to negative interdependence. But they still can't get away from each other. They can't get a divorce to save their lives, so they better make a deal. And sooner or later, the deal they're going to make is going to look like the one that I offered them in 2000 that Mr. Barak accepted and Mr. Arafat turned down. And Arafat figured it out. Not long before he died, he said he wanted the deal. But by then he had an Israeli public that didn't trust him and an Israeli government that wouldn't give it to him. So we know what's going to happen. So yes, you can get it. And I think we have to learn something from, this may sound ironic because so many have died, but I think we have something to learn from the Africans. I think the Peace and Reconciliation Commission that Nelson Mandela set up in South Africa, in Rwanda, where literally, as I said, 10% of the country was slaughtered in 90 days. They have reconciliation villages where you can get free property, but only if you agree to live next door to someone of the opposing ethnic group. And I went to one of those villages, and I saw these two women holding hands. One of them had lost her brother and her husband, and the other was in prison awaiting trial for war crimes, for killing people like that. And they were holding hands. And the president told all the soldiers they could come home, and if they didn't order people to be killed, if all they did was follow orders, they would be subject to the justice of a community court, which essentially would decide for how long they had to do community service and atone and fess up to what they'd done. We can learn a lot from the life and example of Nelson Mandela, the most remarkable human being I think I've ever known. I mean, he said, you know, Mandela realized that the only way he could ever get even for all the terrible things that were done to him was to be free. And that as long as he hated his oppressors, he would always be in prison. He would be in his own self-constructed jail, hemmed in by his oppression and his anger and his resentments. And so he not only invited his jailers to his inauguration, he put the leaders of the political parties who had jailed and beaten and oppressed him and destroyed his marriage and kept him from seeing his kids growing up, he put them in his government. Because he realized the only victory was not getting even, but going beyond. So yes, I'm very hopeful. We just got to learn from those people. And if you look at most of these terrorist societies, let me just make one other point about this. Terrorism relies on treating people like the proverbial Pavlov's dog, right? You've been shafted, you've been ruined, you've been abused, and the only way to get even is to kill people who killed somebody you cared about, and they're heathens and all that. Any shame-based system is doomed to fail. And a lot of people go into this terrorist business out of frustration. Not necessarily they're poor, but a lot of them are, but they're alienated. And they've convinced themselves they can't win in an ordinary system. And they don't have the patience to try to change the rules. And they think they have to react with violence. That is shame-based politics. It's a lousy way to live, a lousy way to do politics. I don't care what problem you've got, somebody else has got a worse one. I don't care how tough it is, somebody else has got it tougher. We've got to get rid of shame-based politics if we expect to have peace.
You talked a little earlier about the work to alleviate the scourge of AIDS and hunger in so many poor parts of the world. How do we get organized to do that? How do the people sitting in this room take a role in ending the AIDS scourge?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that the problem's not over in America, it's just downshifted. AIDS infection rates are actually going up among minority women. They're at a very low rate, but we still have a problem here. So I think continuing to have AIDS awareness, knowing who's most at risk, understanding how to prevent it, and testing people as appropriate is important here in America. In the rest of the world, over 2/3 of the cases are still in Africa, but AIDS is growing more rapidly in India, China, the Caribbean, and the former Soviet Union, just from a much lower base. And so what you can do here, if you care about it, is you can take some time and go volunteer for my foundation or Gates's or any Doctors Without Borders, anybody else that needs help. We need help in all these countries, all of us do. And most of us don't pay very well, but I'm a bleeding heart cheapskate. I think if somebody gives money for me, I've got to get as much of it as possible into the medicine, into the lives and bodies of the people there, or into the medical personnel that are training. But you can do that. Or you can contribute to people that you know will get this life-saving medicine out there at the lowest possible cost. And we do medicine, we do testing, we do all of that, much cheaper than anybody else does it. And I think that's important. So you can give time, you can give money, you can give awareness. One thing you should know is that we seem to be losing the battle in part because there are 4 to 5 million new infections every year. So you would think, well, boy, there's a lot of irresponsible people in the world recklessly infecting others. But that's not quite true. 90% of the HIV positive people in the world don't know they have the virus. And we've never been for comprehensive testing because there was so much stigma attached to it, and until recently, people couldn't get the medicine to stay alive. So why stigmatize somebody who's going to die anyway? But as a consequence, we wind up legitimizing ignorance, which is always a bad thing. That's a form of denial. It's not good. So I'm about to go with Bill Gates in a couple of weeks. We're going to South Africa and Lesotho to look at some of the things we've done together and some things we can do in the future. He has a lot more money than I do, but I go around and build these systems that make things work. That's what I try to do. And in Lesotho this year, it's a small mountain country surrounded by South Africa with the third highest infection rate on earth. About 28% of its population is HIV positive. But they are going to test everybody over 12, promise no discrimination, and promise you medicine if you're HIV positive. So they'll say, come and be tested, have a normal life. So the more we do this, the more we'll need people to be a part of this. We need bodies and we need money. And again, I'll say, it's not a lot of money. I mean, the medicine, our medicine costs $135 a person a year for adults, about $190 for children. That's $10,000 is what we pay here. Our testing costs $20 to $40 a year to see if the medicine's working, and for 50 cents, we can tell you in 20 minutes if you're HIV positive. So it's not that much money. I mean, you can really have, even if you have a modest amount, you can do that, or you can volunteer and be active, or you can still work on the unmet needs here at home or wherever your home is.
Mr. President, last question. Everyone is fascinated by the alliance between you and former President Bush, and we all want to know how you put that together, what it's like working with him, and what lessons are there to be learned from that new relationship?
Well, first of all, I have admired and liked former President Bush for a long time. We met for the first time in 1983, I think, and when he was vice president. And I always liked him personally, even when I ran against him. It was a difficult decision for me in 1992 to run against him because my staff used to make fun of me for saying nice things about him all the time. You know, that you're in a race, these people are saying terrible things about you. I said, I don't care, he's a good man, I like him. We just had differences, and I tried to run the campaign over our differences. And when the tsunami hit South Asia, I basically volunteered to help and suggested that we ought to have some prominent Republican involved. I didn't want any partisan issue here. And I got a call from the White House saying the president wanted to know if we could do it. I would head up an effort with his father to raise money and also to spend money on some projects that government programs wouldn't cover. And I said I'd love to do it, and we just did it, and we had a good time. And then when Katrina came along, we got asked to do it again, and we did it again. We had raised even more money and did even more good. We're not done yet. We're still raising money and still helping people in the Gulf area, which is good because it's going to take us another 3 years before we ever get back to normal, I think, in some of those places. And what lessons you can learn is this. In a free society, difference of opinion is good. Partisan differences are good if they're not turned into ideological demonization. That is, I don't have any fewer disagreements with President Bush, former President Bush, than I did when we started. And we make fun of each other sometimes about where we differ. And I've also, in the process of this, developed a good personal relationship with President Bush, current president, whom I've always thought was a great politician, and I disagree with him on nearly everything. I mean, we have huge differences. But I remind myself of a couple of things. I try to live by what I said to you in this talk. I remind myself that he got a lot of money out of this Congress to fight AIDS, that he did support Prime Minister Blair's effort to double aid to Africa and to forgive the debts of the world's poorest countries, that he has done some things that I agree with. I think he's got the better side of this immigration debate, as opposed to his hardliners that think we can deport 12 million people overnight. So I look for the places where we agree, and I believe if he asked me to do something, if I can do it in good conscience, I should. And we laugh about our differences. I never ask him to change his opinion, and he sure doesn't ask me to change mine. But I'll give you another example. He asked me what I thought of his AIDS program when we were going to the Pope's funeral. And I said, I like it, except you agree with the drug companies that none of the American money should be used to buy these cheap drugs that I've got, and they're just as good as the ones you're paying $1,500 for. So if you spend $1,500 and I spend $135, there's that many people that are dying that you could save. Roughly 10 to 1. So he made a commitment that he would allow the FDA to review all these generic drugs made in India and South Africa that I buy, and if they approve them, then American money could be made available to buy them in poor countries. So I can't complain about that. He kept his word. So what I believe we should do is to try to have more debates about the issues where we differ, but do it by showing respect to our opponents and trying to get at the differences and listening to each other, and then trying to find ways we work together. So that's what I do with former President Bush. I spent 2 summers in a row now. I've gone up and spent the night with him at his place in Maine. We go play golf the next day. He rides me around on that speedboat of his. You know, we're very different. I mean, he's 80-something years old. He still jumps out of airplanes. I just play golf. I don't do that. But I have genuinely come to love him and his wife, and I like them all. And I'm as different from them as daylight and dark. And I can give you a political speech showing you why everything I disagree. But I think it's more effective. And that's the way politics used to be. Abraham Lincoln got elected president. Most people think he was our greatest president. He had these big debates 2 years before with Stephen Douglas, who was his main opponent in the presidential race. They fought like cats and dogs, but he always treated Douglas with respect, even when he was shivering his arguments. And when Douglas was ridiculing Lincoln's arguments, they fought like cats and dogs, but they treated each other as human beings. So that after Lincoln was elected, Douglas said, "What can I do to help you save the Union, save America?" So it's something to remember. And I hope that's an example not just for our country, but for people around the world. I think that, ironically, because former President Bush and I have become such good friends, if we were to preside over or be part of a political debate, I think the people listening would learn more, because the people participating wouldn't be able to be as hateful to each other personally and take as many cheap shots. They'd actually have to talk through what the issues were, what the options were, and what the heck we're going to do about them. And you might be interested to know, we've been all over the world, and people have told us separately and together, this has really helped our country, because we couldn't imagine doing this in our country, and we saw you guys doing it, so maybe we ought to do this. If you think about it, I mean, George Bush and I were given the greatest gift the American people have, and the chance to live our dreams. And we owe it to every person in this country and every person we can help around the world just to do whatever we can between now and when we're called to leave this earth to try to pay back the great opportunity that was given to us. And it's fun. It's more fun. I like working with him. and I like arguing with him. But that doesn't, all my differences with him don't stop me from seeing him as a fine human being who believes what he believes just as strongly as I believe what I believe. And who knows, he may be right once in a while. I mean, that's the whole way we do things in America, you know, at our best. And all this bitter partisanship has been poison for our country. It's nuts, all this personal destruction and personal attacks. And I'll tell you something else. You think about this, every one of you. If you're mad at somebody you're talking to, you cannot hear a word they say. If you're mad at somebody, you can't hear a word they say. You can't possibly have a conversation. And so you're not going to learn anything. And maybe I'm just getting dumber as I get older, but I'm still trying to learn something every day. So I hope it's a good example. I love the guy. What can I tell you? I've had a lot of fun, and I hope it's good.
Thank you, Mr. President.